What is up, YouTube? It's your girl Evelyn, and I am back with the Season 2 recap of Killing Eve. Season 2 kicks off right where Season 1 ended, so make sure to check out my Season 1 recap first. As always, I will be spoiling the entire season, so proceed with caution. Eve is in shock from having just stabbed Villanelle and flees the assassin's apartment. Her phone rings and it's her former boss Carolyn, who somehow knows exactly where she is, and instructs Eve to get her butt back to London ASAP. Eve is in the security line for a train headed to London when she realizes she still has the knife she used to stab Villanelle in her pocket. She ditches it in the bathroom and hops on board. Once back home, Eve's phone rings non-stop. She ignores it and in an attempt at normalcy prepares dinner for her hubby, but it's only after Nico arrives home that Eve realizes she forgot to put the chicken in the oven and Villanelle's blood is still embedded under her fingernails. Eve is not okay. Meanwhile, Villanelle is still alive, but just barely. She throws herself in front of a taxi, and the terrified driver drops her off at the hotel. During her hospital stay, she befriends a teenage patient in the next bed. He's curious about her stab wound, and Villanelle tells him her girlfriend did it to show how much she cared about Villanelle. She goes on to tell him that she knows Eve better than Eve knows herself. The teenager supplies her with some snazzy PJs and helps her secure hospital ID tags and medicine. Villanelle repays him by snapping his neck. She then hides in the back of a minivan headed for London. Eve finally meets with Carolyn and admits to visiting Villanelle's apartment, but leaves out the whole stabbing incident. Carolyn hires her back, believing Eve is the only one who can catch Villanelle. She then tells Eve about the posthumous note left by Nadia, on which she had written the name Alistair Peel. Although Alistair has been dead for 2 months, MI6 had his body exhumed. Eve studies the new evidence and concludes his death was likely the work of her favorite assassin. But what's so special about Alistair Peel? Villanelle arrives in London, swipes some clothes from a laundromat, and hits the grocery store in search of someone to leech off of while healing from her knife wound. She stumbles upon the kind-hearted Julian, who believes her fake sob story and just so happens to have a spare bedroom Villanelle can use for a few days. Eve is officially back in the fold and getting used to the new MI6 headquarters as well as her new team, consisting of newcomers Jess and Hugo. We're not completely sure. We're told she developed a nervousness about the risks of the job. Eve confesses to Kenny about stabbing Villanelle, and he tells her not to tell his mother, thus propelling Eve and Kenny's secret adventures into Season 2. Eve briefs the newbies on Villanelle, and if you weren't convinced of her complete obsession before, the way she stares longingly at Villanelle's photo is all the proof you need. That evening, Eve Googles woman stabbed in Paris and finds an article about Villanelle's hospital roomie. You know, the one whose neck she snapped? Villanelle left a subtle calling card just for Eve, a once-bitten apple left in the boy's hand. Get it? Apple? Eve? Back at Julian's, Villanelle tries to recuperate, but turns out, homeboy is crazy as hell. When her knife wound gets infected, she asks Julian for antibiotics. He tells her she's being silly, then locks her inside the house. Thankfully, she manages to call the 12 and gives them a coded message. She then tries to call her boothang at MI6, but is told Eve Polastri is not in the MI6 directory. Eve is knee-deep in the Alistair Peel murder investigation when she realizes the method of killing, an injection between the toenail, is far too subtle for the brazen Villanelle. This is the work of a new assassin, who Eve nicknames the Ghost. Although still extremely sick, Villanelle gets the upper hand over Julian and stabs him in the neck with a knitting needle. Finally free, she stumbles out of the house and to a car that just so happens to be waiting for her. Inside is her new handler, Raymond, who she takes an immediate disliking to. When she tries to leave the car, Raymond shoves her face into the window and chokes her, saying, "You're on a very tight leash from now on." Moments later, Carolyn and Eve arrive at Julian's house. It seems Villanelle's call to MI6 was traced, and as Raymond drives away, Villanelle longingly stares at Eve. After finding crazy-ass Julian murdered, Carolyn and Eve head to Carolyn's crib, where, to Eve's complete shock, Constantine is sitting on the couch. The 12 want Constantine dead, and the only way to secure his safety was to fake his death and place him and his family in witness protection. Problem is, Constantine isn't allowed any contact with his family. Constantine tries to warn Eve away from Villanelle, telling her Villanelle's love is dangerous and all-consuming, and Eve won't survive it. It's back to business for Villanelle. Her wound has healed and she's once more assassinating targets. In an elevator shaft, she strangles a businessman with his own tie. Afterward, she meets Raymond and he tells her about the new assassin and the quiet way she takes out her victims. He explains that the new assassin doesn't work for the 12, but they want her to. And if Villanelle keeps pissing them off with her flamboyant kills, she'll not only be out of the job, but the ghost's next target. That is, if MI6 doesn't find the new assassin before the 12 do. Villanelle is jealous that Eve's investigating another assassin and sets her sights on Eve's hubby Nico. Disguised as a teacher, Villanelle shows up to Nico's faculty cocktail party. Eve accompanies Nico to the party and meets Gemma, Nico's coworker who clearly wants to bone him. Eve asks Nico to take her to his classroom. Soon things begin to heat up, and Eve's about to receive a little extra credit when she spies an apple sitting on Nico's desk and freaks out, convinced it was left by Villanelle. Speaking of Villanelle, she's still at the party and has befriended the lusty Gemma. She encourages Gemma to seduce Nico because his neglectful wife clearly doesn't deserve him. Meanwhile, Eve, convinced Villanelle is at the school, pulls the fire alarm and rushes outside to try to spot her, but there's no sign of the assassin. A furious Nico tells Eve to go home, and while Eve is distracted, the stealthy Villanelle slips a tube of lipstick in her purse. The next day, Eve and team are investigating the elevator murder, but Eve isn't yet convinced it's Villanelle's work. She thinks it's too ostentatious to be the ghost, but it's not up to Villanelle's usual flamboyance either. She then finds the tube of lipstick Villanelle dropped in her purse. Its name? Love in an Elevator. Eve goes behind Carolyn's back and asks Kenny to hack into the MI6 database and find out where Constantine's family is being held. But Kenny doesn't want to piss off his mom and refuses. Eve yells at him to just do it. Poor Kenny gets the info and Eve strikes a deal with the clearly untrustworthy Constantine. She'll tell him where his family is if he tells her where Villanelle is. Villanelle arrives back at her hotel to find Constantine waiting. Keep in mind, the last time these two saw each other, Villanelle had kidnapped Constantine's daughter and was trying to kill him. Thankfully, Villanelle isn't one to dwell on the past. Constantine offers her a new job. Quit working for the 12 and start freelance assassinating, with him as her handler again. He then warns her MI6 is on the way, and moments later, Eve and crew bust into the hotel. Eve and Villanelle have another erotically charged moment through a closed door, before MI6 rushes in to find an empty room. Carolyn is once again disappointed by Eve. She commands Eve to forget about Villanelle and focus her efforts on Alistair Peel's murder and the ghost. As if she could. Eve finally applies love on an elevator, only to be cut on the lip by a tiny penknife buried inside. We get our first look at someone higher on the MI6 food chain than Carolyn, her boss Helen. After the latest snafu, Helen wants to pull the plug on Eve's operation, but Carolyn insists everything's going to plan. Back at MI6, Eve has spent all night investigating Alistair Peel and the ghost, and she's uncovered a handful of deaths, all made to look inconspicuous and all connecting in some way to Alistair Peel. Eve and Jess speak to Alistair's son Aaron, but he's kind of a prick and not at all helpful. Meanwhile, Villanelle and Constantine are no longer under the thumb of the 12 and getting ready for their first kill for hire. Villanelle is desperate for Eve's attention, and after sending Eve a rather gruesome postcard, Villanelle, dressed in a pig's mask, literally guts her target like a pig, which is sure to get Eve's attention. Or it would if Eve knew about it. Carolyn intercepts Villanelle's postcard to Eve and instructs Jess to investigate. A quick check-in with Eve's marriage shows things are about as terrible as you would imagine. When MI6 assigns a protective detail to live with them, Eve tells him it's standard procedure, but Nico's no idiot. Jess pops up in Amsterdam to investigate the pig murder, and you can practically feel Villanelle's rage. Doesn't Eve care about her anymore? A heartbroken Villanelle goes on a bender in a club and almost kills a random girl before Constantine drags her out. The next morning, we see her shed real tears. Hugo questions Eve about her obsession with Villanelle and asks her if she prefers watching or being watched. Eve replies, both. The moment is charged and Hugo moves in for a kiss just as Eve's phone goes off. It's Kenny. They found the ghost. Eve and team move in on the very normal-looking ghost right after she drops her kids off to school. Eve is questioning the ghost and getting nowhere until she mentions Villanelle's name. The ghost looks frightened and calls Villanelle the demon with no face. She then informs Eve that Villanelle is no longer working for the 12, but when Eve presses her further, asking who she works for, the ghost clams up. Eve gets the crazy idea that psychopathic serial killer Villanelle should interrogate the ghost. She then comes up with an even crazier idea. Eve will order a hit on herself and hire Villanelle to do the job. And Carolyn's like, Jess makes a fantastic point about how Eve is never asked to document any of her work for MI6. And let's not forget, when Villanelle tried to call Eve, MI6 had no record of her. Meanwhile, Villanelle gets her next target and flips out. She refuses, but Constantine tells her to put on her big girl pants and do what needs to be done. For once, Eve and Nico aren't fighting and seem to be enjoying each other's company. Nico tells Eve he's been called away to chaperone a spelling bee in Oxford for the next few days, which is completely Carolyn's doing. Eve then receives a funeral floral arrangement with her name spelled out in roses. Villanelle is coming and Eve is aroused. She grabs Nico and races upstairs for some Villanelle-inspired shagging. Dressed in a bulletproof vest, Eve is ready to get killed by Villanelle. On her way out, Kenny pulls her aside and tells her she's acting batshit crazy. Eve tells him, no problem, she'll just place him on another team. Eve's on the subway, raging, and when a man bumps into her, she almost pushes him into the path of an oncoming subway car. Back at home, she removes her bulletproof vest because, of course she does. Villanelle walks in wearing a veil and holding a bottle of champagne. After a little small talk, they both admit they were afraid the other forgot about them, which is sick and twisted, but kinda sweet. Eve tells Villanelle she put the hit out on herself, and Villanelle's like, whatever, I'm still killing you. She gives Eve a bunch of pills, and Eve, convinced Villanelle is bluffing, takes them. Villanelle immediately freaks out and tells Eve the pills are cyanide. Eve runs to the sink to vomit when Villanelle starts laughing. After the joke, all is forgiven and forgotten, and Villanelle agrees to interrogate the ghost. The ghost is being held in a shipping container in the middle of the forest because, if you haven't figured it out by now, MI6 is just as shady as the 12. Villanelle's interrogation is successful, and she finds out that Alistair Peel's son Aaron hired the ghost. Aaron is in possession of some sort of super weapon, one that everyone wants and he's willing to kill for. Villanelle expects Eve to jump for joy at her success, but instead, Eve gives Villanelle a dry and insincere thank you, and Villanelle storms off. Villanelle is in her feelings, and we all know what she likes to do when she's in her feelings. She pops up in Oxford and tells Nico about Eve stabbing her, thus giving him another reason to doubt his wife. Nico is back from his run-in with Villanelle. It seems he finally understands his wife has a dark side that can only be fulfilled by someone like Villanelle. He orders Eve upstairs on her hands and knees, and they engage in some presumably extra freaky lovemaking. The next morning, Eve is thrilled, but Nico isn't and tells her it's over. But Eve doesn't have time to mourn because the Peel investigation is heating up. Eve and Carolyn decide to use Aaron's alcoholic sister Amber to get close to him. Eve suggests using Villanelle again, and Carolyn's like, Eve briefs Villanelle, who will play the role of Billy, a bored rich girl with a drinking problem. Billy will show up to Amber's AA meetings and befriend her in the hopes of getting closer to Aaron. And if Villanelle gets into any trouble while she's undercover, all she has to do is say the word gentleman. Eve sets up shop at a cafe across from the AA meeting and listens in. Villanelle puts on a show for Eve, using snippets of Eve's life story in her introduction speech. When that doesn't endear her to the group, she tries another tactic: the truth. Most days, I feel nothing. I try to find ways of making myself feel something more, but it doesn't make any difference. No matter what, I don't feel anything. Not long after, Eve gets a little bossy with Villanelle, and Villanelle reminds her that she's, crazy. Then later, Villanelle pushes Amber's annoying chaperone in front of a bus in Eve's view. Although Eve is clearly enjoying her daily tete-a-tete with Villanelle, she checks in with her failing marriage. Nico has temporarily moved in with Gemma, and Eve drops off his stuff, makes everyone uncomfortable in the process, and breaks Gemma's ballerina jewelry box. Villanelle would be proud. Villanelle's been invited to dinner at the Peel residence, and Eve and Constantine are listening in a spy van. Aaron is uber creepy and condescending. During dinner, his bullying behavior becomes too much for Villanelle, and she slaps him in the face with a book and storms out. But instead of heading for the MI6 van, she begins stalking two young women, and right before the inevitable kill, Villanelle reveals herself, and the relieved women invite her to walk with them. Villanelle receives an apology note from Aaron along with an invitation to lunch. Eve pops up unannounced and questions Villanelle about her AA meeting confession. Does she really not feel anything at all? Villanelle tells her it's true, except when she's with Eve. It's lunch date time, and Aaron has rented out an entire restaurant because he's definitely a douchebag and possibly a murdering psychopath. He's already ordered Villanelle's food and intensely watches her eat it. He asks her to accompany him to Rome with the promise of no touching, just watching. When Villanelle gets back to her place, she's greeted by 9 worried voicemails from Eve and smiles. While Eve and the MI6 crew are planning their trip to Rome, Villanelle checks in with Nico. He's at a storage unit with the lusty Gemma, who decides this is the perfect time to make a pass at him. Villanelle pulls out a knife, then proceeds to question Nico about his feelings for both Gemma and Eve. Nico admits he doesn't love Gemma and is still in love with Eve, which was apparently not the answer Villanelle wanted to hear. Eve's getting ready for Rome when the poorly treated Kenny begs her not to go, but before he can elaborate, Carolyn interrupts and whisks Eve away to speak to a psychopath expert about Villanelle. After talking with Eve, the expert tells Carolyn Eve's too close to Villanelle, and Carolyn's like, she tells Eve to make sure Villanelle doesn't kill anyone and sends her on her merry way. In Rome, Eve and Hugo check into their cramped hotel room, while Villanelle checks into Aaron's ginormous villa. Mr. Creepy Controlly has purchased a brand new wardrobe for Villanelle and is watching her every move. Literally. He has cameras in every room. Back at the hotel, Eve and Hugo listen in while Aaron tells Villanelle all about his secret weapon. It's not a weapon per se, but super invasive software that can tell you anything about everyone. After a long day of surveillance, it's bedtime. Hugo goes to sleep, but Eve is wide awake and still listening. While lying in bed, Villanelle asks Eve if she's going to be listening to her all night. She then begins to breathe heavily, very heavily. Eve is immediately aroused. She wakes up Hugo and has sex with him while listening to Villanelle pleasure herself through an earpiece. The next morning, Hugo sees Eve take out the earpiece and realizes he'd been nothing more than a Villanelle surrogate. And we can't forget about poor Nico. Whatever happened after his showdown with Villanelle? The good news is Villanelle didn't kill him. The bad news is she definitely killed Gemma. A bored Villanelle is exploring Aaron's place and comes across his surveillance room. She watches footage of herself as well as footage of other young women, but Aaron did more than just watch these women. He murdered them. Villanelle keeps her discovery to herself and joins Aaron for breakfast. He tells her a potential buyer for his weapon is on the way, showing her a picture of the guy. It's Raymond, her former handler for the 12. Villanelle uses the safe word, gentleman. Back at the hotel, Eve jumps up, ready to rush to Villanelle's aid when she hears a gunshot in the hallway. She hides under the bed just as a man with a gun barges into the room. Thankfully, he gets a call and hurries away. Out in the hallway, Eve finds an injured Hugo, but leaves him to bleed out because her boo-thang is in trouble. She steals a maid's uniform from the hotel, allowing her to infiltrate the Peel Palace, then dramatically burst into the dining room, ready to rescue her damsel in distress. Except her damsel isn't actually in any distress. With her cover now blown, Villanelle drops the fake Billy impersonation and tells Eve about Aaron's home movies as well as his association with 12 handler Raymond. You can actually feel the jealousy flowing between Aaron and Eve. Aaron tells Villanelle she'll eventually get bored with Eve and offers her a job as the killer in his home movies, with the promise she'll never be bored again. He then gives her her first assignment: kill Eve. Villanelle picks up a knife and approaches Eve, but turns around and slits Aaron's throat instead. Unfortunately, the new best buds don't have time to celebrate. Raymond's still en route. Once they're safely away from Aaron's place, Eve insists on returning to the hotel for the surveillance footage. It's the only way to prove Villanelle had a compelling reason for killing Aaron. They agree to meet in front of the hotel in 5 minutes, and Villanelle rushes off to find a car. Back at the hotel, Eve's room has been swept clean. No surveillance equipment and no Hugo. Carolyn then waltzes in and doesn't seem at all upset about Villanelle killing Aaron. Eve quickly realizes that Villanelle murdering Aaron was Carolyn's plan all along. MI6 used Eve and Villanelle to get rid of Aaron without getting their hands dirty. They'll simply blame his murder on the 12. It's a dirty move and Eve is incensed. Meanwhile, Villanelle stumbles upon Constantine while searching for an unlocked car. Constantine tells her Raymond has orders to kill her and implores her to leave with him. He also admits he may have tipped Raymond off in exchange for information about his family's whereabouts. Villanelle refuses to leave Eve and tells Constantine to watch his back. Villanelle enters the hotel in search of Eve and runs into an axe-wielding Raymond. After a few words, they start fighting, but Raymond gets the upper hand and begins choking Villanelle. Eve sneaks up behind Raymond, picks up his abandoned axe, and kills him with it. She and Villanelle flee and end up in some deserted ruins. Villanelle's busy planning their new life together when she's startled by some birds and instinctively draws a gun. Eve realizes Villanelle didn't need her to kill Raymond. She wanted her to. A pissed off Eve tells Villanelle she's going home. Villanelle tries to touch her, and Eve screams at her. Villanelle insists upon their love. "You do love me. I love you. You're mine." Eve turns away, and when Villanelle realizes she's actually leaving her, she shoots Eve. And that is it for the recap. Thank you guys so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more Killing Eve videos, and I'll see you next week.